bit,
I don't know you. So I think it depends on the context.
So it could depend on context,
Yeah.
but the thing also, but wherever we are though, and whatever the result would be, we're still saying that behaviour breeds behaviour, that behaviour will have an impact on somebody's behaviour. But what this is saying is, rather than doing that, rather than responding to somebody else's behaviour, what we do instead is ask the question, I wonder what it is that's driving that person to behave in the way I do. And in fact, NLP takes that even further. It doesn't just ask that question, it then goes on into the question that says, I wonder what it is I am doing that's influencing that person to behave in that way. So it is a clear separation between the person's behaviour and what's driving their behaviour. And rather than be affected by this, we put all our focus on this bit, the bits that drive it.
Is it that similar to like when you talk about transference and counter-transference, isn't it? When
Yes.
you think about it.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good link actually. Now you could still be there now thinking, okay, I now kind of understand where that's coming from, but I still don't buy into it. I still don't buy into the principle. A couple of things worth reflecting on if that's the case. First one is, can you ever think of a situation where you have behaved in a particular way, and then when you reflect back on it, you're thinking, I'm not sure I communicated that in the most effective way that you have. Maybe not around what you said, but there may be a level of regret around how you said it. That I could have done that better or communicated that better. So one question goes, if that's true for you, why then would it not be true for anybody else? The other thing that's worth thinking about, and I'd say this is true for all of these actually, is for a minute, go with the opposite belief. So go with the belief that says, no, actually that's nonsense. Some behaviour has a very deliberate negative intent behind it. And then ask yourself the question, if you hold that belief to be true, what impact does it have? How does that story end? Whereas if I say on every bit of communication, all communication has a positive intention, so I'm separating the person's behaviour from what drives it, all of a sudden their behaviour doesn't have any effect on me. It loses all of its power, its control, its influence over me, because all it is an external representation of what's going on in and that's the bit I want to be curious about. That's what I want to find out, is getting underneath what's driving that behaviour, rather than looking at dealing with the behaviour.
Yeah.
So that's the first part of this, all communication has a positive intention, and it sits here. We then have this second belief that's not contradictory to it, but it is looking at it from a different perspective, which is the true meaning of communication is in the impact. What was people's thoughts on that one? The true meaning of communication is in the impact. Let me paraphrase it with a question then. Do you ever misunderstand communication?
Yes.
But do you ever misunderstand it? Let me paraphrase that another way. If I was to say to you, oh sorry, you've misunderstood me, what am I actually saying?
You got it wrong?
Who got it wrong?
Me.
Yeah, perfect. That's what I'm saying. I'm right, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Could take that even further. I'm clever, you're not. But at a minimum, I'm saying I'm right, you're wrong. Has to be. I'm not saying there's been a misunderstanding. I'm saying you've misunderstood me. Now let's test that. I'm going to say one word, and I'm going to ask each of you in turn the first thing that comes to your mind when I say this word. Duck.
Pond. Squat, as in avoid something.
Quack.
Okay, so pond, squat, quack. So my interpretation of what's been said there is two of you are talking about the animal, one of you where you'd find it, one of them the noise it makes, and then we've got another version of duck which is about a physical movement.
Yeah.
So to
As in
speak.
avoid something.
Yeah,
Duck.
yeah, okay. So I could have meant the bird. I could have meant physical movement. What else could we say? A lack of score in cricket, brand of toilet cleaner, brand of gaffer tape, brand of clothing, bass player from Booker T and the MGs and the Stax House Band, term of endearment from the Derbyshire, Leicestershire sort of area. But let's take your two. Supposing I said duck, and what I meant was, could one of you bring me back a sandwich? And as I say duck, you all dive under the table. And I go, that's not what I meant. Doesn't matter what I meant. The true meaning of communication is all of you under the table.
Yeah.
I was doing a presentation skills course on Tuesday for the RNLI, and one of the things we were talking about in there is however good you get at presenting, or however good you think you get at presenting, if you want to test how effective your presentation has been, there really is only one test of that, which is what is the message that each of your audience members go away with. That's how effective it is. And yet, all of this, you know, how you present and how you present, all of that ties into how you're telling that story. But the effectiveness of it is, what's the idea which people go away with? And this is fine if, in communication, this and this are always the same. Are they?
No.
I mean, we just demonstrated that with duck. Sarcasm. I mean, there can be a whole range of things that tie into that. So one of the things we're going to look at in a minute is these lines that are coming down here, what do they represent?
Filters.
They're filters. Perfect. Filters, or sometimes the other labels given is barriers. And if we say these two people are communicating face to face, you can put all those barriers and filters into two subgroups. How would you subgroup them?
Physical.
How are you defining physical? I think you might be saying what I'm about to say, just using slightly different language on it.
Just things in the way.
Okay, so you're talking
your
about
general area.
Space.
perfect. Okay, so the language I'm going to use is all of that around us is external, and then we've got a whole range of internal barriers and filters. NLP is particularly interested and focuses on those internal barriers, filters, how they work and the impact that they have. But before we move into that, let's just finish with one question on this to finish this particular part off. So if we now start holding this to be true, that this all communication has positive attention, true meaning communications in the impact, and we've got our transmitter here communicating our message that's going through all these filters, and the receiver getting it, and then trying to give some feedback so we are trying to understand are those two the same. Whose responsibility is it to make sure intention and impact are the same? And why do you give your answer?
Transmitter.
Transmitter.
Yeah.
And why would you say transmitter?
Because only he can think about the way he's communicating something.
Because that's the person that
He's communicating.
it's starting
Yeah.
from. Yeah, good answer, good rationale. I think there's a better answer. Whose responsibility is it? Both? Why would you say both?
Because if we hold it to be true,
Yeah.
that all communication has a positive intention, the receiver also has the responsibility to make sure that they've understood the transmitter just as well as the transmitter has.
Again, another really good answer with really good rationale. I think there's a better answer. And in fact, if one of you now said receiver and gave context, I'll go, yeah, I think that's a really good answer. I think there's a better one. Because the fault doesn't lie in your definitions, which were spot on. The fault lies with how I've explained this model. I've done it in the way I have deliberately to try and explain one thing, but my definition falls down when I start using this language of transmitter and receiver. Why?
Because they're both transmitting and receiving.
Perfect. That's not how communication works, that there's a transmitter and a receiver. We play both roles at the same time. As I look around now, all of you are communicating something and I'm interpreting it, and I may be interpreting it different to what your intention is. You may not even have any conscious intention behind it, but we cannot not communicate. Does that make sense? We're always, and maybe the way I describe the model makes the assumption that the communicates the person who's talking. But that's not how communication works. So now bearing that in mind, and these roles don't exist, because we do both at the same time, whose responsibility is it to make sure intention and impact are the same? To me, there's only one answer to this question.
You said it earlier, didn't you?
Not both.
No.
Oh,
Whose responsibility is it?
nobody's.
Almost the opposite.
Everybody's.
No, not that opposite. I just thought that as I said it, naturally that's not the opposite, is it? No, whose responsibility is it?
Mine.
Mine.
Owning it.
Because as soon as I start saying, well, it's ours, that's not a million miles away before I start going, well, you didn't ask any questions. You didn't say you didn't understand. And now all of a sudden, what am I doing? What am I portioning?
Blame.
Blame, perfect. And you can finish that story because that has a level of predictability about how that's going to end. But then if I say in every communication, it's my responsibility to make sure intention and impact are the same. Now the other person may be doing that as well, wonderful. I've got no control over that other person. I only have control over myself. So if I say is me every time, make sure this and this are the same, what does that give me?
Gives you control.
Perfect. It gives me control. And why would I want to relinquish control if there is something so important about understanding what my interpretation of communication is and your communication? And you can look at this and look at breakdowns in relationships. You can almost look at this and look at how wars start. And you can normally trace it back at one point to a different understanding in something that's been communicated from those two people. And because we don't take ownership of it and say it's my responsibility, it then begins to lead us into a, well, I'm not taking the blame for this, and we begin to push it away. NLP, one of the real principles around NLP is about taking ownership, taking control.
Well, I think there's something about language
In which way?
in all of this, in this communication process, because if we go back to
Sorry.
that original question where it says behind every behaviour is an unconscious positive intention.
Yeah.
Now that we've had this explanation, I understand this model to be more in line with empathic behaviour management, which is something that we speak to our carers about, so that
Can you just explain what it is? Because sorry, I don't know the.
So, it's about helping our carers to think, rather than focusing on the behaviour
Yeah.
of a child, it helps them to think about where they're coming from. What is that behaviour actually telling us? So what's the unconscious bit behind that behaviour? So I can more understand that statement now in line with EBM, and it helps them to be empathic rather than being punitive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and making incorrect
Absolutely.
judgments. And so what I'm saying about language and linguistic understanding is that statement there didn't help me to link to what I already know and practice. For some reason, I was thinking of it more in line with something that I don't know and thinking it's new and it probably has a different meaning, when in fact it doesn't have a different
Well, as
meaning,
I
it has
said,
a similar meaning.
My sense was from listening to your conversations that you were, at least my interpretation was, you were appearing to qualify these as statements of fact, and they're not.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what I was thinking, yeah.
That is,
Yeah.
these are definitely not true.
Yeah.
It's just as easy to hold the opposite beliefs, but then you have to ask the question, what impact does it have me holding these to be true? What impact does it have me not holding these to be true? And which one is the better outcome for me?
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, I don't want to, but it is as simple as that on one level. I do recognise that if we hold that to be true, it's far from simple, because we can be replacing years and years and years worth of an habitual approach to communicating. You know, this thing, Daniel Goleman, the kind of godfather of emotional intelligence, I mean, he does overtly word it. If you hold, because this is very much around emotional intelligence as well, if you hold this to be true, particularly that top one, it will fundamentally change how you communicate with people, because it is a fundamental change of how we do communicate with people. But as you've said, the benefit of this is it gives us a level of control that we just won't have if we don't hold those things to be true. I would hope that's enough now for that, so thank you ever so much. Sorry about that.